Hi everyone, my name's Ffion and today I'll be delivering my presentation on Counsellors' tendency towards intimacy, the impact of personality. So to go into a little bit of the background information as to why we've picked this topic. Intimacy is a topic of recent interest in the literature, with it often being referred to as the most rewarding and salient aspect of relationships. Intimacy is something that is valued by so many, and in its absence, feelings of loneliness can take over. This was particularly the case during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, where individuals' ability to be intimate with one another was affected. People all around the world were encouraged to stay indoors, which impacted people's loneliness and their feelings of isolation. The pandemic had a huge impact on the population's well-being as a result of the grief, bereavement, and isolation that was caused. It was reported that many individuals struggled with their relationship satisfaction and interpersonal violence during the pandemic. Alarmingly, during the very first lockdown in the UK, it was reported that there was a 25% increase in calls to abuse hotlines and a 150% increase in visits to domestic abuse websites. This left many people, particularly women, feeling as though home was no longer a safe and intimate space. Research has suggested that intimacy attitudes are framed by our experiences in adolescence and young adulthood. Individuals who are exposed to traumatic events, such as childhood sexual assault and parental divorce, are more likely to be distant and to fear intimacy. Past literature has also highlighted that intimacy can be a core component of many different types of therapy, such as logotherapy and functional analytic psychotherapy. However, there are situations where the lines between appropriate intimacy are blurred, and these therapeutic relationships develop further into intimate friendships and sexual relationships. The inappropriate nature of such intimate relations develop in the absence of boundaries. Ensuring good clinical care to clients is the priority, so these boundaried relationships need to be established at the start of therapy and maintained both during and after therapy. Finally, previous literature has also established relationships between personality with both intimacy and counsellor status. And this background research really helped us to form our hypothesis, which I will now move on to discuss. So like I said there, it was based on this background research that we could form the hypotheses that we did. So the first hypothesis was that individuals who score high on a tendency towards intimacy would score lower for neuroticism and openness, and higher for conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness. The second hypothesis was that counsellors would score higher for openness and agreeableness, and lower for neuroticism, extroversion, and conscientiousness. Now to move on to discuss the methods. 191 participants were recruited for this study. They were recruited through the Student Participation Panel, also known as SONA, through closed Facebook groups and through word of mouth. This number was reduced to 170 following data analysis, as we had to exclude some of the data because of missing responses or people who answered prefer not to say for the majority of the measures that we used. And the measures that we looked at for this study were the demographics questionnaire. This was one we created ourselves, and we looked at gender, age, sex, ethnicity, nationality, and counsellor status. The second measure was the Big Five inventory, and we looked at the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which are the Big Five personality factors. And last but not least, we looked at the Intimacy Attitude Scale Revisited, and we measured intimacy on 4 levels. So we looked at individuals' tendency towards intimacy, their escape intimacy, their attractiveness, and their fear of intimacy. So now to move on to discuss the design and the procedure. We used a correlational design where the predictor variable was personality and the outcome variable was intimacy attitudes. Participants were grouped into either counsellors or non-counsellors, with the counsellor group corresponding to both trainees and fully qualified counsellors. Participants were sent a link via Qualtrics, and through this link they were given an information sheet, a consent form, the link to the 3 questionnaires mentioned on the previous slide, and the debrief form as well. So the study received ethical and governance approval under the proposal number 2022-17152. The participants were given consent and debrief forms, which highlighted their right to skip any questions and withdraw their data at any time. Participants were also given the contact details for Samaritans, Mind, the university's counselling service, and Brook Mental Health websites. They were provided with these details should they wish to seek counselling following their participation in the study, or should they wish to seek extra support for any distress that was caused. Now moving on to the results of the study. We found from a regression analysis that tendency towards intimacy could be explained by counsellor status, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, escape intimacy, and attractiveness. We found that the model we used had predictive capabilities, and that 34% of the variability in scores for tendency towards intimacy could be explained by those factors just mentioned. We found that tendency towards intimacy was positively correlated with extroversion, attractiveness, intimacy, and counsellor status, as demonstrated by those 3 graphs there. The results from the independent samples t-test highlighted that counsellors scored higher than non-counsellors for openness and tendency towards intimacy. Counsellors also scored lower for escape intimacy, despite the graph's appearance. As the items corresponding to escape intimacy were reverse scored, this changed the wording of the questions, meaning that the questions were now a positive nature. So in order to assess a negative aspect of intimacy, such as escape intimacy, we needed to change this direction back during the interpretation of these graphs. Hence, why counsellors were actually scored lower for escape intimacy than for the non-counsellors. So on to the discussion. What does this all mean? So these results suggested that 34% of the individual's tendency towards intimacy could be explained by 4 of the 5 personality subcategories, 2 of the 4 intimacy attitude subcategories, as well as counsellor status. So for 34% of a tendency to intimacy can be explained by personality, other intimacy attitudes, as well as counsellor status. The correlations highlighted that individuals who score higher for a tendency towards intimacy would also score higher for extroversion, attractiveness intimacy, and would be more likely to identify as a counsellor. It was also found that counsellors would be more likely to be open, have a higher tendency towards intimacy, and have a lower escape intimacy compared to the non-counsellors. So now to move on to discuss the limitations with the study. So there are a few limitations that we highlighted, one being the number of counsellors that were present in our sample compared to non-counsellors. The sample was very heavily skewed towards a non-counsellor sample. While significant findings were found for some of the measures of intimacy and personality between the groups, it would be expected that if we had a larger sample of counsellors, these relationships would strengthen and more relationships would become significant. As our sample was primarily taken from SONA, our sample was skewed for age, with most of our participants being under the age of 25. It was skewed for counsellor status, with most of our sample identifying as non-counsellors, and it was skewed towards primarily psychology students. So as SONA is taken from the psychology undergraduate cohort, it could be very difficult to generalise these findings outside of psychology students, to other non-counselling populations, but with a different sampling method, such as systematic, random, or matched pairs, we could increase the validity and the reliability of the sample, encouraging more breadth surrounding different fields and more breadth to the counselling sample as well, and thus improve the generalisability of the sample to a more wider target population. It is also worth noting that no cause and effect could have been established from these findings, but using experimental designs rather than correlational ones could work towards establishing the cause and effect relationships between intimacy and personality. Now to move on to discuss some implications and future research. So, we know that counselling is an intimate profession where clients discuss sensitive and intimate topics during therapy sessions. Therefore, this research is really applicable to the field of counselling and to mental health more generally. We have found that there are particular personality types and intimacy attitudes that are more common for counsellors, these being a tendency towards intimacy, a low escape intimacy, and to be more open. And if being open and intimate are core components of therapy, then this is really interesting that we found these significant differences between these two groups. Now, these findings can further our understanding on the characteristics that are common between counsellors, and further research could seek to explore whether these characteristics are present before training, or whether the skills of openness, empathic understanding, and intimate relating are skills that we learn throughout our training and whilst we are on placement. Future research should seek to consider the remaining 66% of an individual's tendency towards intimacy. We know that 44% is due to personality and to other factors of intimacy as well as counsellor status. What about that remaining 66%? Background research suggests that factors such as adverse childhood experiences, socioeconomic status, well-being, quality of life, and relationship satisfaction all have a relationship with intimacy. So future research should seek to understand whether personality is something that is fixed for counsellors, or whether personality change happens during training and on placement. And with this research, we could gain a broader picture of the relationship that personality has to mental health and to well-being and more generally the field of helping professions. So I'm really excited that this research can be really applicable to the field as we are in, and to learn more about how best we train people and how people react to intimacy and, the differences between our intimacy attitudes as counsellors with people who aren't counsellors, and how we can best meet the needs of our clients. So with all that in mind, I want to lastly conclude with some take-home messages for you all. Intimacy is a core component of therapy. It's the most salient and rewarding aspect of relationships, and it's huge to the work that we do. Counselling training should continue to focus on the development of a tendency towards intimacy. We should keep trying to develop our intimacy attitudes continuously. And by focusing on openness and empathic understanding is a great start. It's a great way of encouraging those intimate relations. But more emphasis should be placed on intimacy and how we create this safe, intimate space. It's also vital that while considering this, we focus on where the client's intimacy attitudes are, and we ensure that we continue to meet them where they are and not rush them into creating this intimate space in therapy. By meeting the client needs and understanding their intimacy, we can better form a picture of how their past experiences have framed their attitudes towards intimacy, and we can better understand this relationship within ourselves. Here are the references for the presentation. Thank you all so much for listening. Please leave any questions you have in the comment section down below. I look forward to hearing from you all there.